Is it water with the sheep in the box?
There's this idea, especially in right-leaning spaces, that collectivism and community are in some way opposed to or contradicted by individual freedom or autonomy that you've probably come across at one point or another if you're even slightly familiar with online political discourse. The idea is that the left want government control and mass surveillance of every aspect of our lives, whereas the right want a Randian nightmare world without any restrictions or regulations on capital, and obviously that's probably true for some people, but it's a massive generalization and exaggeration. For many people on the left, the idea of mass surveillance is a terrifying one, and if our ideas had to come at the cost of personal freedoms, many of us wouldn't still hold them. Likewise, many on the right are a lot more pragmatic and empathetic than the idealism inherent to anarcho-capitalism might require them to be. There's nuance here, is all I'm saying, but the idea that the struggle of left versus right is the same as the struggle between collective and individual rights is an absurd fantasy that nobody should take seriously because, contrary to popular belief, is actually the left that cares most about the rights of the individual and the right to oppose it. After all, there can be no collective without the individual, right? As individuals, we make up our local communities, and sure, we can and should use our collective power and collective bargaining to achieve our goals and shift the balance of power from rich to poor, but that doesn't mean that we have to in some way abandon our individuality or give up our individual rights, at least any more than we already do. Allow me to explain.
I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
This is something I covered extensively in my video about personal responsibility, but to reiterate here, freedom of choice is something that is, if not completely impossible, then at the very least harshly impeded by the workings of a neoliberal capitalist system. People say shit like, oh, if you live under communism, you get told what job to do, what house to live in, and your whole life is dictated by the state, but in many ways, that's also at least partially true under capitalism. Sure, the government doesn't force you into doing anything, but fundamentally, what is the difference between systemic and financial coercion and force? The end result is very much the same either way. Currently, the way our society is set up means that if you don't get a job, you will struggle significantly, your list of job options are restricted by your usefulness to a particular employer, and even if you specialise and get a qualification, something not everyone is able to do due to a number of socioeconomic factors, primarily that most people are unable to just take several years off to study, you'll be pushed into debt and may struggle to find work in your field either way, if you even still want to pursue the same career path you chose as a teenager. You can retrain, sure, but only if you have the time and money to do so. The rest of your life choices are restricted by your financial capability and capital. Sure, in theory, you have a choice of where to live and what to spend your time doing, but in practice you have to operate within a budget and therefore are forced to choose between a small minority of options based on that. Alright, so the government doesn't specifically tell you what house you'll be living in, but you're still restricted to certain specific options. For example, I have a pretty basic office job that really doesn't pay much at all, so regardless of whatever individual rights I may have or individual freedoms neoliberalism supposedly bestows upon me, I'm functionally unable to live in the nicer areas of my town. I'm restricted to either living in a small one-bedroom flat or doing what I currently do and sharing a house with a couple of friends. In theory, I have the freedom to live wherever I want, but in practice, there's no way I'm going to be living in a house by myself because I would be physically incapable of doing so and also being able to afford to eat food. This of course also applies to people who have more pressing needs than myself, who have families and loved ones to look after. A single mother working a similar job to mine would be equally as unable to find a decent place to live, but unlike me, her needs would mean that she would be either forced to take a house she cannot afford in order to have a comfortable home for her children, or else I guess just get the shared house and allow her kids to be cooped up. I know a lot of people who've been forced to do the latter. Freedom to choose between a small pool of equally shitty options is not freedom, in my opinion. Likewise, when it comes to other aspects of our lives that we're told are down to freedom of choice, it's mostly just pointless bullshit, like we get to choose between different brands of smartphone or whether or not to buy the posh biscuits in Tesco's, but these choices are at best frivolous and aesthetic. We don't really have much of a choice in the way our lives go, and at best we get to choose between a couple of basically identical options, but when somewhere like Cuba actually provides people with the same brand of electrical kitchen goods, all of a sudden that's dystopian, because the real freedom of choice is having to choose between 15 identical brands of blender rather than being provided with a blender that would enable people to diversify and increase the amount of available options in what food they can more easily prepare. This fucking tweet is actually just self-parody at this point. The guy's posing in front of fully stocked shelves of electrical goods and food and acting like it's somehow a tragedy that some of the tins of beans don't have a different label and packaging on them for the same product. In the US, everything is owned by 6 companies, which is much better somehow. What is freedom of choice? Real freedom of choice, I mean. Well, as I previously went over in my personal responsibility video, under our current system of neoliberal capitalism, we simply do not and cannot have it, and are unable to utilize it until or unless we pivot to a system in which all of our basic wants and needs are provided for, and we are not beholden to anyone or anything that may influence or impede our ability to make real, impactful choices. Outside of that, we're just existing within the caricature of what conservatives reckon communism is, except instead of being given a house we may or may not like to live in, we're told to choose between renting 4 equally shitty houses and told that that's your lot. If you don't like it, go live on the street. But alright, let's imagine that somehow you are able to accumulate enough wealth for your choices to actually be relatively meaningful. Would you then have the ability to make choices without external influences?
I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
Incentives exist as a direct byproduct of systems of coercion. For example, under capitalism, a system that requires accumulation of wealth for the rich at the expense of the working people, we are incentivized to accumulate as much capital as possible at the expense of others, because this is, for those lower in economic status, the best way to ensure a comfortable life for oneself and one's family, and at the higher levels is a way for one to gain and flex power and influence. Under capitalism, the more money you have, generally the better off your life will be. That's just kind of how it works. This of course then includes incentives for people to do frankly absurd and downright evil things in the pursuit of capital. We reject our inbuilt and natural urge to cooperate with our fellow human beings and instead replace it with ruthless individualism and competitiveness. As you may already be aware, according to anthropological research, individualism is not, contrary to popular belief, a natural part of human psychology and or the human nature that status quo warriors love to bang on about at all. If anything, it's in direct opposition to it. We are, as a species, naturally collaborative rather than competitive, but what benefit is there to collaboration in an individualistic society? Incentives then are powerful things. Indeed, incentives inherent to a system are the main reason we on the left talk so much about systems rather than individuals. All cops are bastards, but that doesn't mean that all cops are inherently bad people on an individual level, though statistically they are more likely to be. It means that they are willingly working within and helping to perpetuate a system of repressive state violence and class warfare, and are therefore an enemy of the working class, even if they're nice people in their personal lives. Likewise, when we talk about landlords, it's fun to post Chairman Mao memes and make jokes about them being leeches, but at the end of the day, the main contention is not that every landlord is individually deliberately evil, but that the very concept of rent-seeking and exploitation of the working class, leveraging capital and manipulation of the property market in order to manufacture a situation in which the average working person has no choice but to rent from a private landlord, is inherently harmful. Everyone has probably had a fair amount of shitty landlords, and probably some better ones too, in their life, but the point is that in order to be a landlord, one must be okay with prioritizing monetary gain over kindness, empathy, and community spirit. However, it cannot be ignored that the fact of the matter is that this is objectively the smartest thing to do in an individualistic capitalist society. Property is one of the few investments a working person can ever hope to attain, and unlike commodities, cryptocurrency, etc., house prices are pretty much guaranteed to rise over the years. Likewise, as an individual, if you find yourself with multiple properties through inheritance, for example, it just makes financial sense to rent one out to make money on the side. It's immoral, but legal, socially acceptable outside of lefty spaces, and generally not a huge financial risk, considering that the vast majority of prospective tenants are pretty decent and considerate. The act of being a landlord or cop or hell, even a billionaire, isn't inherently a case of declaring someone a bad person, but an indication and an acknowledgement that incentives can influence and cause people to take often immoral or harmful action, and that these actions are often morally and socially justified within a system that normalizes them. However, it must be acknowledged that the choice to knowingly exploit and mistreat others for personal gain is not something that can or should be easily forgiven or brushed over. Someone having a reason and understandable motivation to do bad things doesn't eradicate the harm that they do. Incentives do not remove moral choices, though they may influence them. Likewise, to use a more online example, a content creator can be incentivized to specialize or lean into specific kinds of content based on what gets engagement and viewers at the expense of their own artistic beliefs and fulfillment. This person isn't a bad person for doing so, in fact it makes a lot of sense. YouTube and other similar platforms have a whole analytics part on the back end that gives you constant updates on numbers, graphs, video views, viewer retention, subscriber gain, and so on, and crucially tells you whether or not a specific video is doing better or worse than your average content. For example, on my analytics page it shows me that response and or commentary videos do better than long video essays and or documentaries about King Arthur, and that drama content gets engagement. Now, for me, YouTube is a hobby and nothing more, a fun thing I do in my spare time. I have a normal 9-to-5 job and I don't plan on going full-time on YouTube anytime soon, although feel free to donate to me on Patreon if you want to make that more viable as an option in future for me. So for me, I don't really care that much if the passion projects I make don't do as well algorithmically, because I mostly make them for me, in the same way someone might make any other kind of art for personal fulfillment. However, when someone who does do YouTube as a full-time job, whose income is entirely reliant on whether or not these graphs that I don't really ever look at or care about have lines that go upwards, the incentive is always there. If you have a limited time to pump out a video each week, say, and you have to choose between one that you think is important but might get less views and engagements, and one that's pretty vacuous, petty bullshit, but will be guaranteed to get clicks from people on both sides of whatever current drama is raging on some insular online community, well, there's an obvious choice there, right? The most obvious example of this to me is Chud Logic, a content creator I've worked with before and who I know relatively well personally and who I've followed for quite some time, who has openly admitted that he mostly now focuses on drama content on his streams specifically because it gets engagement much more reliably and consistently than content he used to do, where he'd just talk about news stories or mock conservatives for their bad ideas and or aesthetic.
What would you do if you were given powers and tasked with saving the human race? Yes! Now we're talking. Yeah, this guy definitely studied the blade, okay? Look at this! Max Justice Episode 1. ISIS. Oh my god. Oh my god. Episode 2, Mass Shooter. This is brilliant. Oh god, I can't take it. It's too good. It's too good. Oh my god. Oh wow! He's got effects and everything. Oh my god, this is so good! Oh, he's got a light! Yeah. Oh yes! Every time you call me a clout chaser, I'm going to criticise Hassan on stream for 30 minutes, okay? Would you believe it? Hassan has done something extremely egregious.
You're a fucking psycho if you think that that is a charitable person. No, that is a deranged person.
This, out of everything, is the most egregious claim of all. Lying to your audience of over 30,000 people, it is egregious. It is terrible. It is absolutely indefensible. It's a lie. A complete and utter fabrication. I'm mad because the biggest so-called socialist, Marxist, aka total fraud streamer, that is fucking bullshit and totally unacceptable.
If people are twice as likely to click on a video covering some dumb interpersonal drama bullshit, and if this is your full-time job, you are incentivized to lean into that and pivot to primarily that kind of content. Simple as that. That's not to say that I like or want to defend the YouTube algorithm. Of course, it also disincentivizes people experimenting and trying new things with their content, taking a short mental health break and even talking about LGBTQ+ issues. I have personal experience of this, of course. A lot of my pro-LGBTQ+ content gets gets demonetized, and when I spent a while making a couple of weird documentary-style videos, it took a while for my views to go back to normal because the algorithm tends towards punishing you for deviation from your normal style of content. But on the individual level, it does make sense for someone to be incentivized to stick to what reliably works. We content creators may like to pretend to be genius artists pushing the envelope of what's possible in the visual medium, but the fact is that for successful creators, their online existence is primarily a job and a way of getting food on the table and their bills paid, and frankly, that will always come first before any kind of artistic or philosophical concerns. This, of course, is something that is easily used to the advantage of certain powerful people and groups. The government, for example, knows that if the only way that certain kinds of people can access things like education and healthcare is through the military, then a lot of people will be incentivized to join up to shoot brown people or some shit. This is one of the main reasons why things like universal healthcare or student debt abolition are rarely, if ever, strongly advocated for by politicians on either side over in the US, even when implementation of such policies would undeniably be a net positive and are overwhelmingly supported by the majority of voters on both sides of the aisle. Getting votes isn't as important for either conservatives or liberals as maintaining the status quo. As one absolutely unhinged pro-military blog I found online put it, many of those who join the military do so, at least in part, to obtain access to the GI Bill and the financial means to obtain a degree. According to a 2011 Pew Research survey, 75% of those who enlisted said that they did so to obtain educational benefits. That statistic has risen from the pre-9/11 era when it was just 55%, likely because college has become that much more expensive. As of 2014, 48% of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans utilised the GI Bill, with 59% of female veterans doing so, a demographic the military wants to see grow in its rank. If college became free, the incremental value of the GI Bill would be dramatically reduced. The effect would be similar for the Yellow Ribbon program, which provides money for education to those who have already served, ROTC's scholarships, which provide funds to pay for a bachelor's degree for aspiring officers, tuition assistance programs for those already on active duty, and the various programs to fund graduate education for officers. Without the GI Bill as a serious inducement to enlist, the military is likely to experience substantially more difficulty in recruiting new personnel. This will, with little doubt, require us to pay more to recruit tomorrow's force and sustain the qualitative edge of our superb military. The military's ability to recruit is critical not only to its success, but to the very existence of the all-volunteer force. If the all-volunteer military cannot recruit sufficient members of new personnel, it cannot survive. The number of new recruits the military needs varies with government policy and defence requirements. During the height of the Iraq War, it had so much difficulty recruiting and with retaining personnel already serving that it instituted the stop-loss program. Under this policy, the military unilaterally cancelled the end dates on thousands of service members' contracts, forcing them to stay on active duty. If there had been no GI Bill to attract the flow of new recruits in that period that it did, what would the military have been forced to do to swell its rank? Which, I mean, that's pretty on the nose, right? Anyway, here's the important question. If these incentives exist, are as pervasive as they are within society, and ultimately push us into specific paths and ways of thinking or acting, even if this explicitly goes against our instincts and natural human drives and urges, can we be said to be making individual choices or having unassailable individual rights? Where does individualism come in if we're pushed in both subtle and explicit ways towards specific actions and ways of thinking? Remember, you can't just choose not to participate within society, and if you rebel against certain norms and expectations, you will struggle to get by quite significantly. Under capitalism, almost all land has been bought up and is owned by, well, landowners. The commons no longer exist, so if you decide to reject society, unless you buy your own land to live on, there's no way to avoid being influenced by it in some way. So to what extent is it even possible to have individual rights or individual freedom? You're functionally forced into certain specific ways of thinking and viewing the world, and especially other people, and pushed by societal pressures into ways of acting, and are incentivized to take specific actions to make yourself more comfortable and accepted, and if you reject or refuse these imperatives, you will either struggle or simply be unable to survive. The rights of the individual cease to exist when society is all there is. What's the solution to this? Well, maybe if there was some possible alternative to the current system of neoliberal capitalism, if we were to bring back the commons, allow people genuine freedom of choice and autonomy outside of the system, provided them with all their basic needs first and foremost, and let them make their own path in life without any outside influences, pressure, or systems of coercion other than looking out for oneself and one's fellow people, we might legitimately have a chance at giving people a shot at real individual freedom.
I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
I think probably the most misunderstood concept in this whole debate is the difference between private and personal property. This is an idea debated by most lefties, but often gets confused when liberals or conservatives are talking about individualism and its benefits as opposed to collectivism. So to briefly make myself extremely clear and to eliminate the misconceptions of anyone watching, private property, when spoken about in left-wing spaces, does not refer to your personal possessions, your house, car, phone, toothbrush, etc., but property that is used by the capitalist class in order to exploit and abuse the working class. So, for example, the classic go-to is a factory or a rental property. This is not something you need to survive and or really improve your basic level of comfort. It's a means by which you accumulate wealth at the expense of others. This is the property that the left wants to take out of the hands of the rich and put into the hands of the workers. So, for a factory, we would seek to turn it into a democratic operation run by and for those who work in it, and taking rental properties out of the hands of the landlords and giving them to the people who live in and or need them, as a couple of basic examples. Personal property is not of interest to the left. You can keep your house, your car, and your toothbrush, but you only get one house and you can't use your ability to leverage large amounts of capital in order to exploit others. There's a lot of nuance, of course, as stuff like the gig economy complicates matters, and people like Uber drivers are in some places being declared independent contractors rather than employees as to what really counts as private property in the modern world, but for the most part, if you're not using your property to exploit others for personal financial gain, then you're golden. This "the left wants to take your property away from you" bullshit is only a valid concern if you already have property which you're using to exploit others. If not, then frankly you don't benefit from this individualist mindset anyway, so to be honest, it's kind of weird that you're so passionately protecting the interests of billionaires without even getting anything out of it. Speaking of which,
I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
it doesn't take a genius to work out that this idea of individualism and rejection of collectivism explicitly benefits the rich at the expense of the poor because it is designed to do so. After all, if you already have power, you as an individual necessarily benefit from a system that encourages people not to effectively oppose it. Or to put it another way, ordinary working people have very little individual power, but working together, collectively, can affect massive widespread change. Take a look at any movement concerning the rights of minority groups or workers' rights, just as an example. There's a reason large corporations try to prevent unionization. After all, it works. The rich, however, already have immense power and can affect change and influence legislation on a more individual level. A billionaire's version of individualism is significantly different from your average worker, because for the rich, individualism represents a consolidation and protection of power, whereas for the poor, it necessarily reduces and weakens it. Think about those anti-union ads that sometimes go viral online. The idea that they push is usually that an individual should talk to their boss in person to bring up any issues they may have, because on an individual basis, a worker can be silenced, placated, or else removed without difficulty. An individual worker has no bargaining power, unlike a unionized one.
We are not anti-union, but we are not neutral either. We will boldly defend our direct relationship with associates as best for the associate, the business, and our shareholders. We do not believe unions are in the best interest of our customers, our shareholders, or most importantly, our associates. Our business model is built upon speed, innovation, and customer obsession, things that are generally not associated with unions. When we lose sight of those critical focus areas, we jeopardize everyone's job security. We don't badmouth unions in general, but we will speak openly with associates about unions, including any specific concerns about particular unions involved in organizing. And we share our preference for a direct working relationship frequently and boldly, even when no organizing activity has occurred. You will learn about the warning signs most commonly associated with early union organizing, as well as other warning signs that could indicate associate disengagement, vulnerability to organizing, or early organizing activity. While employees have the right to organize, we have a right and responsibility to share our position that a direct working relationship is better for the customer, the company, and the associate. In order to be able to do that effectively, it is critical that we recognize the early warning signs of potential organizing and escalate concerns promptly. If you see warning signs of potential organizing, notify your building HRM and GM site leader immediately. HRMs and GM site leaders should notify their assigned ER managers or ER principal immediately. The most obvious signs would include use of words associated with unions or union-led movements like living wage or steward, petitions or other concerted activity such as an associate purporting to speak on behalf of his or her coworkers when raising concerns, union graffiti, union t-shirts, hats, jackets, or other clothing, union flyers, and union visitors in or near the parking lot. Some signs are less obvious than finding the actual union flyer, but they can still indicate associate disengagement, which is itself a warning sign for potential organizing. Examples include associates who normally aren't connected to each other suddenly hanging out together, associates who were close suddenly stop speaking to each other, groups of associates scatter when approached by management, increased associate negativity, anger, or confrontation, unusual complaints or change in passion or detail around complaints, unusual interest in policies, benefits, employee lists, or other company information, or any other associate behavior that is out of character. For example, an associate who normally leaves promptly begins hanging out in the break room for an hour after work each day. In order to recognize warning signs, it is critical that you know what an associate's normal behavior looks like. Often, it is the change in behavior that is the warning sign, more than the actual behavior itself.
As Harry Haywire Mac McClintock once put it,
I like my boss, he's a good friend of mine. That is why I am standing out in the bread line.
the economic interests of those with power outweigh any concerns about paying workers a decent wage or providing decent working conditions, so capitalists must be forced to provide these things. They can rarely, if ever, be persuaded to do so, and I speak from personal experience here, as someone who was once naive enough to believe that getting a raise was as simple as convincing my boss with logical arguments and appealing to a sense of decency, only to be threatened with the sack in response. Individualism is a con, a cudgel with which the rich can bludgeon the poor whilst pretending like they're doing it for their own good. Besides, the rich don't even believe in it. Not really. They believe in it as long as it allows them to avoid taxes, but the moment they struggle or about to go broke, all of a sudden, actually, no, daddy government, please bail me out. I'm too big to fail and the invisible hand of the market isn't as based as I thought it was. This is what happened after the 2008 financial crash, rather famously, and on a lesser scale still happens today as corporations and private companies embrace government subsidies and bailouts whilst the poor get fucked. The government won't allow you to eat hot meals if you lose your job, but will pay Elon Musk, at time of writing the world's richest man, literally billions in subsidies to keep SpaceX, Tesla, and the absolute failure of a product that was Solar City afloat and profitable. Despite Musk himself LARPing as a libertarian and tweeting about how much he hates government subsidies when they go to people other than him, Amazon likewise receives similar amounts to Musk's companies, and indeed, as one report showed, the amount it receives in subsidies actually exceeds the amount it pays in taxes, meaning that the existence of Amazon is literally a net loss for the taxpayer despite its massive profits. Oh, and also Musk famously recently made the decision to relocate all his businesses' head offices to Texas, specifically in order to avoid higher taxes in California, so let's not pretend that this is about getting compensation for paying taxes or some shit. This is what individualism is to them. The government pays basically fuck all to help those in the greatest need, and astronomical sums to those at the top of the pyramid of capitalist exploitation to keep them in diamond watches or whatever. Even the people who benefit most from individualism don't really believe in it, but are happy to use it to justify exploiting idealistic working class people who have been convinced that the system works, and that is both sad and dangerous. Have you ever heard the common saying, capitalism for the rich, socialism for the poor? Well, it's not really accurate, and whoever came up with it clearly doesn't know what socialism is, but this is what it refers to. The rich have class solidarity, and their relationship with the government is not antagonistic, as many of them like to pretend, but is in fact symbiotic. Ironically, the exact opposite is true of the relationship between the government and the working class, but libertarians and the mega wealthy like to pretend that actually they're the ones who are most oppressed by the government that gives them billions in free money to prop themselves up. The rich have significantly more class solidarity than most people realise, and maybe it's time to try building some of our own and working together to demand our individual rights and freedoms from the people who really took them from us.
That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Alright, so what do we think? Well, to begin with, what is freedom? Can what we have right now under capitalism be considered freedom of choice? A system in which we get to choose between like 3 or 4 options at most at any given time? Is there such a thing as true freedom under capitalism? A system that influences in both subtle and unsubtle ways, the ways in which we interact with the world in extremely profound ways. It's unavoidable at this point. It's a bit an overdone bit, but we really do live in a society and we are inevitably, inexorably pushed and pulled towards conformity to it, whether we want to or not. The commons no longer exist, and if you want to get by in a capitalist system, you will inevitably need to pander to the whims of capital. You need money to live, and you are coerced in a number of ways to conform and to build capital, either to survive or to gain power and influence against your moral and instinctive judgment. And lastly, let us not forget that the principles of this idea, this ideology, are not evenly distributed across class lines. The rich benefit significantly more from the poor believing in it, and when it comes down to it, don't even really sincerely believe in it themselves. The government is bad and illegitimate when they tax billionaires, pay out unemployment benefits and fund hospitals, but when the government pumps billions in subsidies and bailouts into the pockets of the super rich, these so-called anti-government types aren't exactly too proud to accept it. What protects the ordinary person more than anything else? What guaranteed basic fundamental rights for the worker? What freed the slaves, won the vote for women and abolished Section 28? Was it the rugged individual fighting for the rights of billionaires? Or was it in fact collective action, unionization, and people working together to leverage power to achieve justice for the individual? The individual person's right to freedom and autonomy are important, but being completely honest here, the individual and the community, or the collective, are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to separate, because it's individuals that make up the collective, and it's the collective that's most effectively able to fight for the rights of the individual. Trying to position them as opposites or in some way antagonistic forces is absurd and makes no sense unless you already know what utter bullshit this is, and you are just looking for an excuse to exploit the poor while telling them that actually you're doing them a favour and are fighting for their individual freedoms or some bullshit. But that would be ridiculous, right? Hello everyone, thanks for watching this little rant, I guess, that I just did. This is something that I've been thinking about for a while. I guess it comes down to the essentialization and polarization of the way we view politics and philosophy and things like that. But yeah, it's something that has been very confusing to me, just observing how people often talk about this subject. I hope you liked the video. If you want to support me, there's a link to Patreon that will be on the screen and also on my link tree, which will be in the description. If you do so, you'll get your name on screen like this. If you donate more than $2, I'll read your name out over the credits, and you also get early access to things like, well, videos. They go up there a couple of days early usually, and video scripts and things like that. If you donate $5 or more, you'll be getting extra content from me. I'm thinking that I'm probably just going to record like some little vlogs or maybe commentaries on some older videos. That is definitely still coming. I know it's been taking a while, but I want to do something that people will actually be happy to pay for, you know? But yeah, so thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. So today, I'd especially like to thank Elise the Mighty She-Beast, Aride, Chris Vagnacci, Generally Queer. Next we have Ryan, Brian, The Bulk, Tom Newport, Blues, Caleb Shipley, Felix Sanguis, Klaas Strupp, Nanza Kambe, Off to Wears Hats, Susie M, and of course Les the Mystical Dinosaur, and his friend Bob. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!